We already talked about labor and equipment costs in Chapter 8. These are direct costs because they are directly related to the mine operation. For a complete evaluation of a project or a feasibility study, many other costs must also be considered, and that's what we are going to cover in this chapter. Labor costs can represent 50% or more of controllable operating costs in a mine. So how do we develop labor costs for the whole mine? There are 3 steps in this process. First of all, develop an organization chart showing all site personnel. Second, tabulate all personnel not associated with specific equipment or already defined cost structures, or centers, sorry. And number 3, tabulate all personnel directly associated with each cost center. In surface mining, almost all members of the operating workforce are directly associated with the equipment. Similarly, maintenance labor estimates are strongly related to the mine equipment. In underground mining, most of the operating workforce are associated with defined activities, not equipment. In this table, this table is on page 165. For operators directly associated with equipment, the workforce numbers proceed from the equipment operating hours schedule via division by the scheduled time each year that an operator is working the machine. So this table represents a matrix of required equipment operating time by year, which is divided by the operating hours for each operator. There it is there, and then yields the number of operators you need to staff the equipment on an annual basis, which is shown in table 11-2. The organizational structure of the mine is usually the most logical categorization of labor. The organization chart shows the responsibilities and reporting lines and subdivides the organization as a whole into cost centers and divisions that often correspond with cost centers used elsewhere in the mine costing. So this chart is shown on page 166 of your book. Assuming anything outside the mining operations area is an indirect cost, the following items should also be examined: government charges, freight, civil works, development costs, administrative costs, pit and maintenance services. And we are going to cover these each individually. So how we define each of these categories of indirect costs: first of all, government charges. Those are royalties, property taxes, levies, and bonds for reclamation. Freight. In many mining countries, transport of product from mine site to port is controlled by government-regulated transport methods. Civil works, there's 2 of them, on-site and off-site. On-site are roads, dams, buildings, power supply, etc., everything within the mine gate. And then off-site are the roads, railways, port, shiploading, water supply, accommodations, power supply, etc. Development costs include exploration, land purchase, cost of investigations, for example, groundwater, feasibility studies, consulting, and permitting. And although these costs are not always a large component of total costs, development costs are high risk. Much of this expenditure must be made before commitment, when there is no guarantee the project will even proceed. Next one, administrative costs. These are the head office and site administration, including staff salaries, communications, advice from specialists, consultants, computers, and other office running costs. Then pit and maintenance service items are sometimes categorized as direct costs and sometimes as indirect costs. They include light vehicles, cranes, general workshop costs, pumps, lights, and miscellaneous equipment. Figure 11-2 on page 168 shows a typical input and the structure of a cost database. The cost database is a table of unit costs for each of these items. And so you get the cash flow by multiplying the operating items, such as fuel, by their unit costs. Shown on this slide is table 11.3 from page 169. When you do a whole project study, you should build your estimates based on cost centers or groups of activities related by function. Within each cost center, A budget can be determined to include equipment, operating costs, labor, and capital expenditure. After you calculate the costs, the presentation of cost by cost center can be made with pie charts. Here's an example of one mining study, and you can see this on page 170 in your book. Keeping track of all these numbers can be a daunting task. You don't want to miss anything, and the flow chart shown in this is a system for building up all the elements of final cash flow from the various components, putting it all together basically. And this is shown on page 171 of your text. The steps in preparing the final cash flow are as follows. First, you prepare a production schedule. Then you prepare a schedule of major operating items. Third, you divide the project into cost centers. And fourth, you determine equipment purchase and replacement schedules. These form the major input to the costing schedules. These operating schedules are multiplied by the unit cost from the cost database to calculate equipment operating costs, labor costs, total operating costs, total capital costs, and cash in outflows. After these schedules of annual costs are prepared, a more detailed economic analysis can be prepared where you incorporate additional inputs. And these include revenue estimates and future market considerations, taxation, alternative schemes that may save or delay taxes and depreciation, escalation as well as likely changes to the plan if characteristics of the mine changes, interest rates, debt and equity considerations, and corporate structure, strategic risk assessment, and finally sensitivity analysis. This cycle may have to be repeated many times before a project reaches the implementation stage. So far, we've been looking at economic decisions that are non-strategic. Our economic decisions are based on the facts before us, a piece of equipment, a mine site, a production schedule, etc. Strategic decisions are those that take into account the influences of customers, suppliers, competitors, and others whose aims cannot be assumed to be consistent with the aims of our mining company as we seek to maximize the wealth of our shareholders. Anyone who has ever heard of Peter Drucker knows he was one of the foremost management gurus of the 20th century. Peter Drucker stated, "Decisions exist only in the present. The question faces the long-range planner is not what we should do tomorrow. It is, what do we have to do today to be ready for an uncertain tomorrow? The question is not what will happen in the future. It is what futuristics do we have to factor into our present thinking and doing. What time spans do we have to consider, and how do we converge them to a simultaneous decision in the present?" So once a project has been proposed or is in operation, how can it be structured or managed for the highest probability of achieving expectations? The capital investment decision process is distinguished by two characteristics. First, the value in capital investments materializes only in the unknowable future that takes time to come to fruition. And then capital investments are heterogeneous. In other words, they're widely dissimilar, they're varied, they're diverse. So they are heterogeneous bundles of value. Consumer goods can be tried and returned with little loss of value, and the choice is informed through the benefit of repeat purchases. The example given in the book is the second-hand value of a mine shaft built to access an unknown ore body cannot readily be returned for money back or turned to some other purpose, like you can with consumer goods. The benefits of hindsight can make you a wise person. We all know hindsight is 20/20. Well, how does an organization know when it knows enough to make the best decision possible? The reality, this is pretty interesting, the reality is that many poorly selected choices are made by mining companies who did not know that they did not know some important fact. Yet the knowledge may have been available within the mining industry or even from within their own organization at the time the decision was made. In mining, uncertainty is substantial and frequently unresolvable, and these are the reasons why. Markets for mining products are far from well defined. Geological characteristics are different for every single deposit. Impurities vary, and that has value to particular customers, and government controls influence the prices. So risks are not unique to the mineral industry, but it is the area of risk that mineral industry investments differ most from standard investment models. If a past decision has yielded results different from original expectations, then this could be due to a combination of three causes: luck, either good or bad, insufficient or incorrect data, or a flawed process of recognizing value. So remember that there are always uncertainties in any decision involving mining, but the challenge is to separate the random uncertainties from those that are predictable. You can't totally discount luck. For example, let's say you run a hardware store and you just got a shipment of plywood that was more than you ordered. A week later, a hurricane began a track toward your area and your plywood sold out in 2 days. Luck? Well, maybe. The preconditions for decision making are as follows. First, dissatisfaction or uneasiness with the current state of affairs or with the state of affairs as they are envisaged to materialize in the absence of action. Number 2, an imagined set of conditions that are more satisfactory. And number 3, the expectation that purposeful behavior directed toward bringing about the imagined set of conditions has the power to remove or at least alleviate the felt uneasiness. So in economic terms, the first condition spells out the net present value of the do-nothing alternative. The second condition spells out the net present value of the proposed course of action. And then the third condition, an expectation, emphasizes the uncertainty aspects of fitting the proposed course of action into an existing framework. Action is the outcome of choice among alternatives, each of which has an expected value, and each of which has some uncertainty that this value will materialize. So under uncertainty, value has 2 dimensions, and a decision will rely on a meeting of the minds in 4 different areas. First, the expected value of the do-nothing option. Second, the uncertainty surrounding this option. Third, the expected value of the proposed alternative course of action. And fourth, the uncertainty surrounding this alternative course of action. So how does a company deal with a high risk, high uncertainty projects? Do they just abandon them? No, the answer is diversification. So the return from the unexpectedly bad projects in the portfolio will balance the return from the unexpectedly good projects. So on average, the expected return should be received, and the risk in aggregate will be within the company's tolerance for risk. So in conclusion, we talked a lot in this chapter about visualizing the future, creating the conditions for making good decisions without relying on luck so we can take our company to the next level. Mining involves a lot of uncertainty, and companies pay good money for people to predict future conditions. Predicting is not the same as forecasting. When you think of a forecast, you think of a weatherman, and you know how often they are wrong. Predicting looks at conditions as they exist, and based on experience, you can predict that a certain outcome will result. If we have an earthquake off the coast of Japan, for example, I can predict that possibility of a tsunami resulting from the offshore earthquake.